3 days ago, survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse sat down inside West Palm Beach City Hall and testified before Congress. The location was deliberate. The building sits less than 3 miles from the Palm Beach mansion where federal investigators say more than 1,200 women and girls were abused. It is also roughly the same distance from Mar-a-Lago. 8 witnesses testified. 4 of them were survivors. And the detail that has stayed with me since is not what they said about Epstein, it is what they said about the Department of Justice. Let me walk you through what actually happened at that hearing, and then I want to show you the specific document pattern that one congresswoman called something other than incompetence. The hearing was organized by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. Republicans were not invited. The ranking member, Robert Garcia of California, opened by saying the investigation has entered a new phase. He said the DOJ is still holding back 2.5 million documents. The Epstein Files Transparency Act, which passed both chambers with bipartisan support and was signed into law by Donald Trump in November, required the full release of those files. The DOJ says it has complied. Garcia says the math does not add up. That is the backdrop. Now here is what the witnesses said. A woman identified only as Rosa testified under her first name. She came to the United States from Uzbekistan at 18 years old. A modeling agency run by Jean-Luc Brunel, an Epstein associate, promised her a career. She said the agency told her she owed $10,000 on arrival. Less than a month after she arrived, the agency sent her to meet Jeffrey Epstein. She was abused by him for 3 years. Part of that period was 2009. Epstein was under house arrest at the time. She said he spoke about his arrest like it was a game. Rosa is not a name that appeared in news coverage before Tuesday. She came forward for the first time at this hearing, and when she woke up after the DOJ's January release of the Epstein files, she found her name in those documents more than 500 times. 500 times. The names of the men who abused her were redacted. Courtney Wild testified that Epstein began abusing her when she was 14 years old. She reported it to federal authorities. She said prosecutors never told her about the non-prosecution agreement that was being negotiated. She found out years later by reading the record herself. She said, "They made the deal behind closed doors. They never told me, and they never told any of us." Maria Farmer testified via video. She says she reported Epstein's abuse to the FBI in 1996. She spoke to agents again in 2006. 12 years passed between her first report to federal law enforcement and the moment prosecutors offered Epstein a deal that spared him from federal prison. The deal also granted immunity to unnamed co-conspirators. The identities of those co-conspirators have not been fully disclosed. That is not a contested claim. It is in the text of the agreement. Sky Roberts testified about his sister. Virginia Giuffre was one of Epstein's most prominent accusers. She died by suicide last year. Now here is the part that the hearing made impossible to ignore. Congress passed a law. The president signed it. The law required the DOJ to release the files and to protect the identities of survivors in the process. The DOJ released over 3.5 million pages in January, and attorneys representing more than 200 victims filed an emergency motion in federal court within 72 hours of that release, calling it the single most egregious violation of victim privacy in one day in United States history. A Wall Street Journal review found at least 43 survivors' full names exposed. More than 24 were minors when abused. Some names appeared over 100 times. Home addresses were visible in keyword searches. Attorneys for survivors said they had given the DOJ a list of 350 victims' names specifically for redaction. A simple search would have caught the errors. The DOJ did not perform one. At the same time, the names of perpetrators remained redacted. Survivor names exposed. Perpetrator names protected. A congresswoman used a specific word for that pattern. She called it witness intimidation, but then came the detail that shifted the hearing. When Congress was given access to review unredacted files on a secure government server, the DOJ logged their searches. Every query a lawmaker ran was tracked. When that became public, the reaction was bipartisan. Jayapal called it outrageous. Raskin called it an outrageous abuse of power. Mace called it disturbing and a form of intimidation. Speaker Johnson said it was inappropriate. The DOJ acknowledged the logging and explained that the department tracks all searches to protect against the release of victim information. Think carefully about that explanation. The DOJ said it monitored what elected members of Congress were searching for inside the Epstein files in order to protect victims. The same department that exposed 500 references to Rosa, that left 43 survivors' names in a public database, that released unredacted photographs until the New York Times called to report them, and that watched its own release produce death threats against Jane Doe's. That department said it was tracking congressional searches to protect victims. The hearing on Tuesday was a field hearing, not an official one. Republicans did not participate. Chairman Comer has said a formal hearing will follow once depositions are complete. It has not been scheduled. There are 2.5 million documents the DOJ says it has reviewed and withheld. The Transparency Act required those documents to be public. The DOJ says it has fulfilled its legal obligations. Garcia says the original files consist of more than 6 million pages. The DOJ released 3.5 million. The gap between those two numbers has not been explained. There is also the matter of the non-prosecution agreement. The 2008 deal negotiated by Alex Acosta gave Epstein a guilty plea to lesser state charges, work release from a county jail, and federal immunity for himself and unnamed co-conspirators. A federal judge later ruled the agreement violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act because survivors were never notified. Courtney Wild's case was among those covered by the deal she was never told about. Epstein was not federally prosecuted until 2019. He died in federal custody before trial. The question the hearing put on the record is one the DOJ has not answered publicly. When the law says release the documents and protect the survivors, and the result is survivor names exposed and perpetrator names redacted, the question is not whether a mistake occurred. The question is whose name stayed hidden and why. Rosa came forward for the first time on Tuesday. She testified 3 miles from the place where she says she was abused. She had kept her identity protected as a Jane Doe. She stepped forward hoping those who allowed this to happen would be held accountable. She woke up to find her name in the released files more than 500 times. The men who abused her remained redacted. The hearing produced a record. The documents are in the public domain. The congresswoman who called this witness intimidation did so under oath at a congressional proceeding. The survivors who testified did so by name, or by the first name they chose, in a room that was filmed and archived. 2.5 million documents are still being withheld. The formal hearing has not been scheduled, and somewhere in those files, according to a DOJ letter to Congress, are the names of approximately 280 politically exposed persons. That list has not been released to the public. The investigation, Garcia said, has entered a new phase. The survivors who testified on Tuesday would like to know what took so long to get here.